Okay, so now without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Alex Chausovsky, Senior Analyst from ITR Economics. Alex has been presenting for MCAA for several years, both at this event and through special webinars. His insights have helped many of us navigate the changing winds as we continue to face forward. Alex is a highly experienced market researcher and analyst with significant expertise in subjects that include macroeconomics, machinery production, electric motors and controls, mechanical and fluid power products, and industrial energy efficiency. He is currently responsible for providing reliable industry and company forecast, presentations, and economic consulting services to small businesses, trade associations, and Fortune 500 companies across a spectrum of industries. Please join me in welcoming Alex to the stage.
In the second half of 2018. So I feel like it is my duty and my responsibility to tell you that while the rest of this year will still be a good year for your business, you're going to see growth, you're going to see a lot of customer demand. By the time we get into late 2018 and into 2019, we will have gone through a shift in the business cycle. We will transition from something called Phase B, which is accelerating growth, to Phase C, which is slowing economic growth, and then have the potential for some of your markets and some verticals to enter what is called Phase D, which is a recession. Now, and if you can take steps now to prepare yourself, you can weather the storm and actually leverage to come out of it stronger on the other side. And that's what I hope that my advice today will help you do over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. So that's changing around us at a faster pace than we can keep up with. And I think it's your responsibility as business owners, as decision makers, to think about not how do I personally adapt to this over the next 5 to 10 years, but rather, well, will my company be a decade from now when these are the people that are our main customers, that only want to do business in this e-commerce type of digital platform environment. So I understand it's difficult, I understand it's expensive, but as a great quote says, survival is not mandatory, right? You don't have to adapt, but if you want to be around 10 to 15 years from now, I think it's critically important for you to not only devote time and people, but also resources in the form of money to making sure that you have a comprehensive digital platform, an e-commerce strategy that is not instead of your traditional approach, but rather as a parallel. It is not an either-or scenario anymore. You have to have both in order to thrive in this ever-evolving marketplace. So just wanted to leave you with that thought. But to conclude the story, over a 6-hour period, my daughter raised $475 selling lemonade. And I'm thinking, I am in the wrong business here, right? Yes. About 40% of that came through PayPal and Venmo. And it's amazing, right? She would not have met her goal if she didn't adapt on the fly to the changing dynamics of that particular marketplace. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about whether to invest or not, right? Because my daughter and her generation are your next generation of customers, right? Okay. Anyway, so Winds of Change is the name of the presentation. You can see my title at the company, Senior Consulting Advisor. So the good news for you is, even though you're full of that delicious chicken over lunch and likely wanting to take a nap based on the hair color I mostly see in this room, this is not going to be a traditional economic presentation, right? Okay, this is going to be a advice-driven presentation. I will tell you about what's going on in the overall economy, but I will also give you practical and actionable advice to support this information. So hopefully you can walk away with some wisdom and understanding as well as knowledge gained from the charts and the figures that I'll be presenting. So there's a lot going on in the economy today. There's continuing economic rise at the macro level, both in the US and in the world. But since I presented the last webinar in October or November, we've had some really interesting political developments. Tax reform, these tariffs that have been instigated. We're now talking about trade, whether or not the NAFTA deal is going to get repealed. We're going to talk about those and see what the ramifications of these developments have been. We're also going to look at input from leading indicators, and I'm going to show you as a proven hard piece of evidence why it is that we expect the cyclical peak to occur in the US economy. We had material price increases. On top of those two major things this year, we've got the impact of the tariffs, and more importantly, that very few people are aware of, we've got some shipping and logistics cost increases that are going to be double digits, okay? Near term, but not enough people, in my opinion, are talking about what the long-term implications of that are going to be, but I will make that message very clear for you today. Drives your business. GDP is not an accurate representation of MCAA member business, and you should not use it as a benchmark to compare yourself and set your own goals. You should be thinking about industrial production, and I'm going to talk to you about that in just a second. Keep in mind, the reason that GDP is not a good barometer for your business is that so much of it comes from the consumer. The money that everyone in this room spends eating out at restaurants, going to the movies, buying electronics, clothing, furniture, cars, that drives 2/3 of the US economy as represented by GDP. Another major component is the government spending piece that accounts for 17%, but your industry, MCAA, is really reflected by that business investment slice that is 16% of the overall GDP. And that's what you need to be looking for when you're assessing your own performance. So if we look at industrial production, collapse in commodity prices, and the resulting decrease in demand much more acutely, as an industry here, the MCAA member base felt that decline that occurred in 2016 and really started territory. This is good news, and this is why you should be paying attention to industrial production rather than GDP when benchmarking yourself to some sort of economic data. If we look at the forecasts for industrial production, you can see a similar pattern, incoming peak in the third quarter of this year, but when you look at the decline that we're calling for in 2019, that is more overtly negative. So after 2.9% growth this year, we are actually going to shrink by 1.2% on the industrial production index in 2019. So again, nothing overly scary, nothing to run for the hills over, but something to be aware of and to start planning for right now. For example, if you're looking to add people, I would say it's likely too late in the business cycle to be adding operational folks. The manufacturing capacity that you have in place right now is likely sufficient to sustain you through the end of next year. But I do think that if you're able to add some talented salespeople, especially ones that come with industry experience, that can bring some existing customers on board, that might allow you to extend your own rising trend beyond what the economy and industrial production will support. So that's the kind of behavior that you're looking to influence when you understand the difference between industrial production and GDP. That your businesses need to know what's going on and make the appropriate action at the right time in order to not only get through it relatively unscathed, but actually profit during the downturn, and then know when to turn the spigot back on to take advantage of the 2.3% growth that we're going to have in 2020. So mild and brief is the name of the game for the 2019 downturn. Be prepared for more growth in 2020 and in 2021. You can understand that there is a very close cyclical relationship that exists between these two series. Blue line here is industrial production, red line is GDP. You can see both of them are currently moving in sync. The engine is revving full speed. But it is going to come to an end, as I already told you, and there's going to be downside pressure as we get into the late 2018, early 2019 timeframe. Of the three components that make up industrial production, I think manufacturing is likely going to be able to weather it the best. There's some positive things going on that we'll talk about for manufacturing. But as with typical boom and bust cycles, you're likely to see more overt negativity in the mining and oil and gas components. As demand for the raw materials themselves kind of weakens, you're going to see more negativity in those segments of industrial production than you are in manufacturing, which is a much more broad-based industry and much more diversified in nature. If we look to our northern neighbor, Canada, it's currently doing quite well. So what you're seeing in a chart like this is the rates of change are on top. The orange line there is the quarter-over-quarter growth rate plotted over time. The blue line is the year-over-year growth rate. And on the bottom is the actual value of the Canadian Industrial Production Index. So you can see it's actually in record territory right now. 374.1 is the billions of dollars of 2007 chain Canadian dollars. So the value of the Canadian economy is at a record high level right now. But if you pay attention to the rates of change, it is signaling that the peak in the Canadian economy is also coming in the near term. That orange line, you can see the near-term rate of change, the 312, has already peaked and is starting to pull back. It has downward passed the blue line, which is the annual growth number, and that is an ITR checking point. It says that the 312, the quarterly growth rate, leads the 1212 by about 3 to 6 months. So it's a near-term directional indicator that the Canadian economy is about to transition from accelerating growth into slowing growth. And that's a large part of the reason why our forecast for the Canadian industrial production sector of that particular economy is only 1.7% growth, despite the fact that they're currently growing at a rate of 5% year over year. So clearly, the slowdown in the Canadian economy is going to occur over the next 6 to 9 months. If we look at Mexico, it's quite a different story. Mexico has been on the negative end of some of the policies of the administration. There's been a lot of uncertainty. Businesses have really pulled back investment because they don't want to stir the ire of the administration by building plants or moving production down to Mexico. So if you see the blue number at the top of that chart, negative 0.3%, that means that the Mexican economy actually shrank in 2017 relative to where it was in 2016. But again, we have a checking point where the orange line, the short-term growth rate, upward past the blue line, suggesting that the economy in Mexico is about to turn the corner. And that's why we do believe that by the end of this year, they will be able to eke out some positive growth, 0.5% to be exact. I mean, nothing major, right? But it's good to have a positive economic year compared to the negative year that they had back in 2017. So that's an encouraging sign that the worst of it may be behind us for Mexico. However, I think the big question mark at this point is what happens with NAFTA, right? Are we able to come to some sort of negotiated solution or NAFTA, or does the United States withdraw from NAFTA, which would actually have quite negative ramifications for the Mexican economy and for the Canadian one at that as well. So that's the big picture view, right? We've got good growth in the US, we've got good growth in Canada, Mexico is turning around. That's going to transition to that slowing growth period for the US and Canada, at least in the near term. But last year I made a big point of telling you that we don't forecast based on developments in the political arena. We don't change on forecast based on the promises that President Trump made during the election campaign in 2006. What we do is we wait for actual developments to unfold, for policy to be passed, and then we adjust our forecast when we think it's necessary. So we now have had several important political developments, starting with tax reform. So I wanted to take a impartial, completely non-preferential, bipartisan view at the potential impact of the tax reform policy that was passed late last year, early this year, and whether or not there's credible evidence that it can actually support U.S. GDP growth rising to 4%, 5%, or 6% year over year, as the administration would like to see happen. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that historically, there's not a lot of preference on the part of the economy between Republican and Democratic policy. It's very evident here. The white line, that's the rate of change for GDP. That's overlaid on Republican and Democratic administrations. And you can see very clearly there's no clear-cut correlation between growth or contraction in the U.S. economy and the type of administration that's in power. Right? In fact, if you think about the impact of political decisions, there's quite a long lag between when that decision is made and when it actually starts to affect the economy. Right? So taking this tax reform package at its face value, it's really not going to show up as a bottom line until people and corporations are filing their taxes in early 2019. So you can see that kind of 6 to 12-month lag that typically exists between policy and when it starts to have an impact on the ground. But the reality is we don't really believe that there's going to be that significant lift to the US economy, and our rates have changed high level right now. That means that people are more likely to invest, and that's good for US economic growth. The accelerated depreciation provision, I think, is going to be very helpful. You know, this change to being able to write off 100% of an asset purchase in the first year versus 50% last year. And the big change, in my opinion, is that it's no longer applicable only to new products. You can also write off used equipment purchases at 100% rate during the first year of ownership. So those are the type of things that really move the needle. But when you look at corporate tax reform, the specific big selling point that the administration often used, there's, again, if you look at it very rationally, driven by data, there's not a whole lot of evidence that there's going to be a big boost to business investment as a result of a lower corporate tax rate. So what you can see here in this chart, the dark blue or purple line at the top, that is the average corporate tax rate in America between 1960 and 2016. So you can see up to 1986, when the Reagan administration passed some major tax reform, the average corporate tax rate was about 48%. Now, we then had the Reagan package come through. The average corporate tax rate since then has been 35%. So down from 48 on average to 35, about a 13 percentage point change, similar to what we saw happen this time, down from 35 to 21%. Now keep in mind, 35%, 48%, 21%, these are the official tax rates that are published. These are not, by any means, the effective tax rates that companies actually pay. Right? Corporations have found all sorts of ways to get around the tax code where the effective corporate tax rate in the United States, at least over the last decade, has been something like 10 to 15% on average. It varies slightly from company to company, but that's the amount of taxes that corporations have actually been paying, right? But if we focus back on the official listed corporate tax rate, the really interesting takeaway from the slide is on the bottom. That green line represents the percentage of our economy that is made up by business investment. And as you can see, even when we had a significant decline in the corporate tax rate from 48% to 35%, there was essentially no movement on the amount of business investment as a percentage of our GDP. It has roughly been around 12.5% to 13% of our overall economy consistently over the last 50 years or even more, right? So we can certainly hope that this time is different, right? But if you look at it in a very kind of detached way, being driven only by data and precedent, we do not see any evidence that lowering the corporate tax rate in and of itself will have a major positive impact on our economic growth rate in this country. Impression, I should say, that we're projecting for the 2030s, all that much more likely to come to pass. So if you're not already thinking about that, I highly recommend that you start. And you start putting action plans in place right now for how you're going to protect your business and your own family from a prolonged economic downturn that is going to be exacerbated by both the retirement of the baby boomer generation and the strain that that puts on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and this continued accumulation of national debt at higher and higher interest rates. Those two things will come together to create an environment where the government is cutting spending with one hand and increasing taxes, both for individuals and corporations with the other hand, and that is bad juju. You do not want to have yourself in that situation because the pain is going to be very acute, right? So we've talked about this, and I'll take some questions on this in the long run, but I just want you to understand what's happening. We are, unfortunately, much more confident that this behavior will induce the Great Depression of the 2030s than we were just a year ago. Okay? So I just want to make sure that you understand the ramifications. Although the talk tends to be mostly positive, very few people are actually calling attention to the negative consequences of this tax reform package. My advice here would be, again, if you haven't reached out to your utility customers, this is a good opportunity and a good time for you to do so. why I say that is that as a business, all of you have resources that you need to deploy. Salespeople, marketing dollars, what do you target? So when you're thinking about the kind of moves you need to make, you've got to go after the lower hanging fruit. And so understand which vertical markets will continue to grow this year, which ones will be flat, and which ones will be negative, and then spend most of your efforts on the industry sectors that are actually going to be supportive of the type of growth that you want to achieve in your business. It's all about resource deployment by the end of the year that they are in right now. That goes very much in line with our business cycle expectations of that peak coming and then a slowing down in both the general and the industrial economy in this country over the next 6 to 9 months. So to summarize everything we've talked about today, the reason why you're so busy right now and the reason why 2017 was a banner year for you is because we were right there. Phase B, the best part of the business cycle, accelerating growth. By the end of this year, we will transition to phase C, which is the slowing growth phase of the cycle. So still expansion, but just not at the rapid pace that we saw over the last 12 to 18 months. And depending on your markets and your regional location, you will likely see some phase D activity, recessionary pressure, as we transition into 2019. So, I hope that you can leverage the information that I've shared with you today to make better informed decisions. This is a great quote from Deming. It is not enough to do your best. You must know what to do and then do your best. So please do look at your own data, pay attention to your leading indicators.